At 27,000 feet over Schweinfurt, Germany on October 14, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Archangelo pressed his face against the freezing plexiglass of his ball turret and watched something impossible. A Focke-Wulf 190 was diving straight at his B-17, closing speed over 400 miles per hour. Every instinct screamed at him to wait for the clear shot, wait until the enemy filled his gun sight. That's what the manual said. That's what every instructor at gunnery school had drilled into him for long months. But Archangelo didn't wait. Instead, he did something that every instructor would have called insane. He opened fire at 200 yards, 4 times the maximum effective range. His twin .50 caliber machine guns roared to life. The vibration shook the small steel ball turret that hung beneath the bomber's belly. Tracers arced out into the empty sky. Bright orange streaks burning through the thin air. The Focke-Wulf kept coming. Archangelo kept firing. His hands vibrated against triggers. Hot shell casings clinked and rattled against the curved turret walls. The German fighter grew larger in his sight. At 800 yards, the nose of the FW-190 suddenly flashed. Cannon fire. 20mm shells streaked upward toward the B-17's belly. Archangelo didn't flinch. He held the triggers down. His gun barrels glowed cherry red in the freezing air. Then something strange happened. The Focke-Wulf twitched just slightly, a tiny hesitation in its dive, a half-second movement. Almost no one else would have noticed, but Archangelo saw it. The German pilot had seen the tracers, not close enough to hit, not accurate enough to kill, but close enough to make him think, close enough to make him doubt his angle, close enough to make him adjust his dive. That adjustment saved Archangelo's life. The cannon shells that should have torn through the ball turret missed by 15 feet. Instead, they punched through the B-17's right wing, through aluminum, through fuel tanks, through hydraulic lines. The wing erupted in orange flame. The bomber shuddered violently. The entire aircraft vibrated like it might break apart in mid-air, but Archangelo was still alive, still firing. The FW-190 flashed past at nearly 500 miles per hour. Gone in half a second, Archangelo spun the turret, tracking it as it climbed away. His guns kept hammering. The fighter pulled up into a steep climbing turn. Archangelo's tracers followed it like a searching finger across the sky. Over intercom. The pilot's voice crackled with confusion. Ball turret. What the hell are you shooting at? That fighter was out of range. Archangelo didn't answer. He was watching the German fighter. It was now 1,400 yards away, climbing, banking, lining up for another attack pass. But something about the maneuver looked different. The pilot was hesitating, thinking, calculating, wondering if the American gunner below had gotten lucky. Or if he actually knew something the Luftwaffe did. Archangelo had discovered something that morning, something that contradicted everything the Army Air Forces taught about aerial gunnery. Something that shouldn't work, something that made absolutely no tactical sense, but it worked. And by the end of that mission, the bloodiest day in 8th Air Force history, 60 B-17 bombers would be shot down. 600 men would die. But in ball turrets across the bomber formation, a handful of gunners would start doing what Archangelo had done, firing early, firing at impossible range, firing through their own bombers' wings if they had to, and those gunners would shoot down twice as many German fighters as anyone else. What happened next wasn't written in any training manual. The myth of the Flying Fortress, the problem had started a year earlier. In 1942, when the first B-17 Flying Fortresses arrived in England, the aircraft was supposed to be nearly invincible. 13.50 caliber machine guns, heavy armor plating, self-sealing tanks. Boeing engineers promised the bomber could defend itself without fighter escort. They called it a flying fortress for a reason, but the Luftwaffe proved them wrong in less than 3 weeks. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17 bombers attacked the rail yards at Rouen, France. German fighters swarmed them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s. They came in fast, head-on attacks at closing speeds over 500 miles per hour. The American gunners fired. They followed their training. They went for the clear shot. They aimed carefully. They missed. Every single gunner missed. The German fighters ripped through the formation. 20mm cannon, 30mm cannons, explosive shells slammed into the bombers. One B-17 spiraled downward in flames, then another. The survivors limped back to England with dead men in gun positions and holes in the fuselage big enough to crawl through. After the mission, commanders studied the gun camera footage. They interviewed the surviving gunners. They analyzed bullet patterns. The conclusion was obvious. The gunners were firing too late. By the time a German fighter filled the gun sight, it was already too close. The closing speed was too high. The gunner had maybe half a second to fire before the fighter flashed past. A second wasn't enough. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They had been fighting since 1939. They had shot down RAF Hurricanes over France, Soviet fighters over Russia, British bombers over Germany. They understood geometry, they understood timing. They knew if they came in fast enough, if they committed fully to a head-on attack, the American gunner would hesitate, would wait for the perfect moment, would squeeze the trigger just a fraction of a second too late. Then the German pilot would already have fired and broken away. The statistics were brutal. The 8th Air Force lost 4% of its bombers on every mission. 4 out of every 100 B-17s didn't come home. Bomber crew had to fly 25 missions to complete their combat tour. Do the math. Most men didn't survive. Commanders tried everything to solve the problem. They changed formations. They created tighter defensive boxes. They staggered bomber altitudes so guns could overlap their fields of fire. They added more machine guns. They trained gunners harder. They even brought clay pigeon shooting instructors from Texas to teach deflection shooting, leading the target like a duck hunter. Nothing worked. The kill-to-miss ratio stayed almost exactly the same. For every 100 rounds fired, maybe one hit. And the B-17s kept going down. Replacement crews kept arriving from the United States, young men, 19 and 20 years old. Boys who had never seen combat. They climbed into the gun positions, they followed the manual, and many of them died. By the summer of 1943, bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force had started calling themselves something darkly humorous. Clay pigeons. It was a joke. It was a survival calculation. Every gunner in a B-17 knew the numbers. If a German fighter attacked head-on, the closing speed between the two aircraft could exceed 500 miles per hour. At that speed, distance disappeared frighteningly fast. From the moment a fighter appeared as a black dot on the horizon, the gunner had only a few seconds to 3 seconds to see the fighter, 3 seconds to identify her, 3 seconds to swing the gun's aim and fire, 3 seconds while the German pilot lined up his cannons, 3 seconds before someone died. The American gunners were trained to fire at about 400 yards. That was considered the effective range for accurate shooting, but the German pilots were already firing at 600 yards.
They always fired first. That simple equation was killing American crews. The German pilot approaching head-on had a huge advantage. He could line up the entire bomber formation in his gun sight.
He had powerful cannons that could fire explosive shells. The American gunner, meanwhile, was trying to hit a target that was moving toward him at nearly the speed of sound, and the window to fire was less than a second. Even experienced gunners struggled with that timing. For the young replacements arriving from the United States, it was nearly impossible. The situation became even worse in late 1943. That was when the Luftwaffe introduced a new tactic, something terrifying. They called it the Storm Group method, specially modified FW-19. Fighters were fitted with extra armor plating. Heavy steel plates protected the pilot. Thicker glass reinforced the canopy. And most importantly, the aircraft carried 4 20mm cannons. Each cannon could fire explosive shells capable of tearing through a bomber's fuselage. The pilots flying these aircraft were given a simple order: get close, very close, close to 200 yards before firing, close enough to see the American gunner's face. Then fire everything forecast. Guns, a 2-second burst. That burst could cut a B-17 in half. The tactic worked because it exploited human psychology. When a fighter plane came straight toward you at 500 miles per hour, your brain screamed at you to shoot immediately. But if you fired too early, you wasted ammunition. If you fired too late, you were already dead. The sweet spot was about 400 yards. At that distance, a skilled gunner could walk his tracers into the target. But at those closing speeds, 400 yards disappeared in less than 2 seconds. German pilots knew exactly how to exploit that hesitation. They had been trained for years. They understood that American gunners were waiting for the perfect shot, waiting for the target to fill the gun sight, waiting for the moment when accuracy seemed guaranteed. And while the Americans were waiting, the Germans were already firing. The results were devastating. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a massive bombing raid against the German city of Schweinfurt. The target was a group of ball-bearing factories. These factories were critical to the German war industry. Without ball bearings, tanks couldn't move. Aircraft engines couldn't function. Factories couldn't operate. The Americans sent 291 B-17 bombers into Germany. It was one of the largest daylight bombing missions of the war. But there was a problem. The bombers had to fly deep into enemy territory, too deep for fighter escort. American fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt simply didn't have the range yet. Once the bombers crossed into central Germany, they were alone. Hundreds of miles from Helt, the Luftwaffe was waiting. German radar detected the incoming formation hours before it reached the target. Fighter bases across Germany scrambled their aircraft, FW-190s, Bf-19s, heavy Bf-110 interceptors. They climbed to meet the bombers and they attacked relentlessly. Wave after wave of fighters slashed through the formation, head-on attacks, side attack, diving passes. Explosive cannon shells ripped to aluminum wings. Engines exploded. Fuel tanks ignited. Bombers fell from the sky trailing black smoke. Some crews tried to bail out. Others stayed with their aircraft until the last moment. Inside the ball turrets and gun positions, the gunners fired desperately, but many of them were still following the manual, waiting for the perfect shot, waiting for the target to fill the gun sight. By the time they fired, the German fighter had already shot first. When the surviving bombers finally returned to England, the damage reports were staggering. 60 B-17 bombers had been destroyed. 17 more were so badly damaged they had to be scrapped. More than 650 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The mission became known as Black Thursday. It was the worst loss the 8th Air Force had suffered in a single day. After the mission, commanders held emergency meetings. They reviewed combat reports. They studied gun footage frame by frame. They interviewed every surviving gunner they could find, and a strange pattern began to appear. The gunners who had survived the attacks weren't always the best marksmen. They weren't the most accurate shooters. They were the ones who had broken the rules. They were the ones who had fired early, very early. Some of them had opened fire at 800 yards, others at 1,000 yards, a few even at 1,200 yards or more. At those distances, hitting a fighter should have been nearly impossible. A German fighter at 1,000 yards looked no larger than a pencil eraser held at arm's length. The bullet drop at that range was enormous, more than 50 feet. Wind, speed, and deflection made precise aiming almost impossible. The machine gun rounds also spread out in a widening cone. At 1,000 yards, that cone of fire could be more than 30 feet wide. By every standard of military training, firing at that distance was pointless. So why were those gunners surviving more often? The explanation was simple: suppressive fire. The theory was that incoming tracers made attacking pilots nervous. Even if the bullets weren't accurate, the sight of orange streaks rushing toward the cockpit could make a pilot flinch. That hesitation could cause a pilot to break off his attack slightly earlier than planned. A tiny adjustment in angle or timing could mean the difference between hitting the bomber and missing it entirely. But the explanation didn't fully satisfy everyone, not Michael Archangelo. Archangelo had been thinking about what happened over Schweinfurt ever since his bomber landed. He had worked in his father's machine shop before the war. He understood machinery, he understood tolerances, and he understood something the training manuals didn't teach. A machine gun wasn't just a weapon, it was a signal, a warning, a way to change the mathematics of a dogfight before the dogfight even started. Archangelo had watched a German fighter hesitate because of tracers. That hesitation had saved his life, and if it worked once, maybe it could work every time. What Archangelo didn't realize yet was that he was about to discover something far more important than marksmanship. He was about to discover how to control the battlefield without ever hitting the enemy. After the Schweinfurt mission, Michael Archangelo couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the sky that day. Something about it bothered him, not the fear, not the near miss. Though things were normal in combat, what bothered him was the reaction of the German fighter pilot, that tiny hesitation, that twitch in the dive. Archangelo had seen it clearly through the plexiglass of his ball turret. The German pilot had reacted to the tracers, not because they were accurate, not because they were lethal, but because they were there. Because they existed in the airspace he intended to fly through. That idea stayed in Archangelo's mind for weeks. He thought about it during missions over Germany. He thought about it while lying awake in the barracks at night, and he thought about it while cleaning the twin .50 caliber machine guns in his turret. Most gunners treated their weapons like simple tools: pull the trigger, point at the target, hope for a hit, but Archangelo saw them differently. To him, a machine gun was a mechanical system, a predictable system. It fired bullets at nearly 2,900 feet per second, at 27,000 feet altitude, where the air was thinner. Those bullets traveled even farther than they did at sea level. Drag was lower. The bullets held their speed longer. That meant something interesting, even at extreme distances. Distances where accurate hits were unlikely. The bullets still carried enormous energy. At 1,000,000,050 caliber rounds still carried enough power to punch through aluminum aircraft skin, enough to damage a wing, enough to shatter a canopy, enough to scare a pilot. And fear, Archangelo realized, was a weapon. This encounter, the moment that confirmed his theory, came a few weeks later. It was November 1943. Archangelo's B-17 had just completed a bombing mission over Bremen. The bomber formation was scattered. Several aircraft had already been shot down over the target. Others were damaged and struggling to keep altitude. Archangelo's bomber was one of the stragglers. They were flying home across the North Sea low on fuel, low on ammunition. That was when Archangelo saw it, a single Focke-Wulf 190 trail. Them at a distance. The German fighter wasn't attacking yet. It was stalking them, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. Archangelo studied it carefully through the turret glass. The fighter was about 2,000 yards away, too far to shoot at least according to the training manual, but Archangelo wasn't thinking about the manual anymore. He was thinking about airspace, about geometry, about where the fighter wanted to be. The German pilot would eventually die if he would choose an approach. Corridor. A path through the sky that gave him the best angle for attack, and that path was empty until Archangelo filled it. He opened fire at 2,000 yards. At a target barely larger than a thumbnail, he didn't aim at the fighter. Instead, he aimed at the empty sky in front of it. Then he held the triggers down. The twin machine guns roared. Tracers streaked outward in a long glowing arc, left, right, down. A curtain of fire, a moving wall of orange streaks the German pilot saw. Instantly, the fighter broke left, climbing sharply, circling away. A minute later, the FW-190 tried again. This time it approached from a slightly different angle. Archangelo tracked it and fired again, another long burst. Another curtain of tracers. Again, the fighter broke off. The same thing happened 4 times. Each time, the German pilot tried a new angle of attack. Each time, Archangelo fired early, a absurdly early, before the fighter had even committed to the attack run, and each time the pilot hesitated. Each time he broke off. Finally, after the fourth attempt, the FW-19 simply gave up. The German pilot waggled his wings and turned back toward Germany. Archangelo watched it disappear into the clouds. He had fired only a few hundred rounds. He had not hit the fighter, not once, but he had survived, and so had the rest of the crew. A new way of thinking. When the bomber landed in England, Archangelo went straight to the armorer, a veteran maintenance sergeant named Diageo. Diageo had been working on .50 caliber machine guns since before Pearl Harbor. He understood weapons, he understood ballistics, and he understood something most officers didn't. Combat often rewrote the rule book. Archangelo explained his idea: the long-range fire, the denial of attack corridors, the psychological pressure on enemy pilots. Diageo listened carefully, then he nodded slowly, because he had been hearing similar stories from other gunners, different bomb groups, but the same pattern. Gunners who fired early survived more often, not because they hit more targets, but because enemy fighters hesitated. Diageo explained the physics. A .50 caliber round at 1,000 yards still had enormous energy. It might not penetrate heavy armor, but it could easily punch holes in thin aluminum. It could damage control surfaces, it could crack a canopy, and even if it missed completely, it still sent a message. It told the attacking pilot something important. This gunner, awake. This gunner is aggressive. This gunner will start shooting long before you expect it. That information changed the psychology of the attack, because a fighter pilot approaching a bomber wasn't just flying, he was calculating speed, distance, angle, closure rate. He had maybe 5 seconds to plan his attack, 5 seconds before committing to a dive. And once he committed, he was vulnerable. He couldn't dodge easily. He couldn't turn away quickly. He had to hold his course. Iftrasser appeared during those 5 seconds. The pilot faced a decision: ignore them and risk being hit, or abort the attack and try again later. Most pilots chose the second option, not because they were cowards, but because aborting cost them nothing. They could circle around, look for an easier target, wait for a better opportunity. The third discovery, Archangelo soon realized something else, something even more surprising. He began aiming through his own bomber's wings. It sounded insane, almost but the geometry worked. When a fighter attacked head-on, it usually dove toward the bomber at an angle of about 30 degrees. At high speed, the aircraft was dropping rapidly as it approached. That meant a gunner couldn't aim directly at the fighter's current position. He had to aim higher, much higher, high enough that the bullets would rise above the bomber's wings before falling back down. The wings became a reference point. If the tracers passed just above the wing, the angle was correct. The bullets would travel upward first, then arc downward through the airspace the fighter was diving into. Even if the bullets missed, the tracers would appear directly in front of the attacking pilot, right in the corridor he intended to fly through. The pilot would see them and hesitate, and hesitation was survival. The first true test. Archangelo tested this theory on his next mission, December 1943. Another raid over Germany. 2 FW-190 fighters appeared ahead of the former. Both were preparing head-on attacks. Archangelo opened fire at nearly 1,400 yards. He aimed high. His tracers arced over the B-17's nose. Both German fighters saw them and both broke left simultaneously. Neither fired a shot. After the mission, Archangelo showed the gun camera footage to Sergeant Diageo. The armorer watched the film twice, then he smiled. "You're not shooting at the fighter," Diageo said. "You're shooting at the airspace." Archangelo nodded. Exactly, he wasn't trying to the enemy. He was denying the enemy the space he needed to attack, and that changed everything. The beginning of a quiet revolution. The technique spread quietly. At first it was just a few gunners in Archangelo's bomb group. They talked about it in the barracks after missions, shared observations, compared results. Then other crews started noticing bombers with early firing gunners were returning more often. Enemy fighters were breaking off attacks sooner. Losses were slowly decreasing. Called it a new tactic, yet nobody wrote it in the manual. But something had changed in the skies over Germany. And it had started with a simple realization. Sometimes you don't have to hit the enemy. Sometimes all you have to do is make him think twice. By early 1944, the idea that Michael Archangelo had experimented with inside his ball turret was no longer a secret. It was spreading, not through official orders, not through training manuals, but through something far more powerful inside. Wartime military. The unofficial network of enlisted men, sergeants talking to sergeants, gunners sharing stories in cold barracks after missions, crew chiefs discussing what they had seen while repairing bullet-torn bombers. Word traveled quietly across the bomber bases of eastern England. A new way to fight fighters: shoot high, deny the approach corridor. At first it was just a handful of gunners. A waist gunner named Jack Murphy in the 303rd Bomb Group started using the method. Murphy was 20 years old, freckles, red hair, and a farm boy from Iowa. Before the war, he had spent years hunting pheasants with his father. He understood something instinctively that many trained gunners didn't. You don't shoot where the bird is, you shoot where it's going to be. Murphy applied that same logic to enemy fighters. One January mission in 1944 proved the technique worked. Murphy's bomber had fallen slightly behind the formation after bombing a target in Germany. That made them vulnerable. Stragglers were prime targets for German fighters. Sure enough, a Messerschmitt Bf-19 appeared behind them. The fighter stayed back at about 800 yards, watching, waiting, deciding whether the damaged bomber was an easy kill. Murphy didn't wait for the fighter to commit. He opened fire immediately at nearly 800 yards, a distance where hitting the target should have been impossible. But Murphy wasn't trying to hit the fighter. He aimed high. Above the aircraft, his tracers curved through the sky in a long glowing arc. The Bf-19 pilot saw them instantly. He broke right, climbed away, circled wide for another approach. Murphy tracked him and fired again. Same technique, long range, high arc. The fighter broke off again. This happened 6 times. 6 attempted attacks, 6 long bursts of tracers, 6 aborted approaches. Murphy fired nearly 400 rounds that day. He didn't score a single hit, but the German fighter never got closer than 1,200 yards. Never fired a shot. Eventually, the Bf-19 turned away and disappeared toward the German coast. Murphy's bomber limped safely back to England. When they landed, the pilot asked Murphy what had happened. Murphy simply shrugged. I just kept shooting where he wanted to fly. The pilot told other crews, and the story spread. Informal training by February 1944. The technique was spreading beyond the 303rd Bomb Group. The 379th Bomb Group began experimenting with it. Then the 91st, ball turret, gunners, waist gunners, even nose gunners started trying the method. One gunner named Sam Feinstein took it a step further. Feinstein began teaching the technique to new crews, not officially, just informal lessons between missions. He would stand on the concrete hardstands between parked bombers, point at the B-17's wings, explain the geometry. You don't aim at the fighter, he told them. You aim where the fighter wants to be. He would show them how tracers should arc over the bombers, how the bullets would climb and then drop into the attack corridor. Many of the new gunners were skeptical. It sounded crazy. It contradicted everything they had learned in training. But Feinstein had flown 23 combat missions and he was still alive. That was proof enough. By March 1944, hundreds of bomber gunners were experimenting with early fire. They didn't call it a tactic. They didn't have a name for it. Some called it shooting high. Others called it long-range fire. Simply called it shooting early. The officers officially ignored it, but they couldn't ignore the results. Loss rates were slowly dropping. In January, the 3rd Bomb Group had lost 7 bombers. In February, the number dropped to 5. In March, it fell to 3. Something was working. Big week. The true test came in February 1944. A massive Allied bombing campaign known as Big Week. The target was Germany's aircraft industry, factories that produced fighters, factories that built engines, factories that manufactured critical aircraft components. The Allies planned to hit them all at once, wave after wave of bombers, hundreds of aircraft for days. The 8th Air Force launched more than 1,000 bombers into German airspace. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had left. FW-190 fighters, Bf-19 interceptors, heavy twin-engine Bf-110s, even experimental jet fighters. German pilots attacked relentlessly, but something was different now. The bomber formations were fired earlier, much earlier, at 200 yards, 500 yards, sometimes even farther, the sky filled with tracers, thousands of glowing orange streaks crossing the sky in every direction. To an outside observer, it looked chaotic, like panic fire, but it wasn't panic, it was geometry. Each gunner was filling a piece of airspace, creating a barrier of fire around the bomber formation. German pilots began encountering something they had never seen before. A wall, not a physical wall, a wall of tracers. Approach corridors that had once been empty were now filled with glowing lines of incoming fire. A German fighter diving toward the formation suddenly found itself flying directly into that wall. Some pilots pushed through it, most didn't, most broke away, circled, looked for another opening, but the openings were disappearing. Every bomber had gunners firing early now. Every corridor seemed blocked. The German pilots gave it a name, the Wall of Fire. A German perspective, Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's most experienced fighter aces, encountered it firsthand. Baer had more than 200 victories. He was fearless, highly skilled, and extremely aggressive in combat. In June 1944, Baer led a group of FW-190 fighters against a formation of American bombers near Munich. He spotted a bomber lagging slightly behind the formation. A perfect target, Baer pushed his aircraft into a steep dive. Classic head-on attack, textbook approach. At 400 yards, the tracers began, bright orange streaks racing toward him, not aimed directly at his plane, aimed at the space ahead of him, the space he was diving into. Baer held his course. He had seen defensive fire before. He knew most of it missed. But at 200 yards, something struck his aircraft, a single .50 caliber bullet. It punched through the aluminum skin of his left wing. The impact jolted the control stick in his hand. His airspeed dropped slightly. It wasn't serious damage, but it was enough. Baer aborted the attack after examined the hole in his wing. One bullet, one lucky hit, at an absurd distance. But that bullet had changed something important. It had changed his confidence. The next time he attacked a bomber formation, he would remember that hit, and he would hesitate. That hesitation was exactly what the American gunners were counting on. The Luftwaffe, adapts German commanders, quickly realized something had changed. American bomber defenses had become far more aggressive. Gunners were filling the sky with tracers, denying the approach corridors that German pilots relied on. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They shifted tactics. Instead of head-on attacks, some fighters began approaching from behind, but B-17s had powerful tail guns, and now the waist gunners were firing early too. The Germans attempted coordinated mass attacks, dozens of fighters diving simultaneously from different angles. The idea was to overwhelm the gunners, but such attacks required perfect timing and radio coordination, and by 1944, the Luftwaffe was already running short of experienced pilots. They tried heavily armored Sturmbach fighters designed to absorb defensive fire, but the extra armor made the aircraft slower, less maneuverable, easier targets for Allied escort fighters, and the escorts had finally arrived. Long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt could now escort bombers all the way into Germany. That meant German pilots had less time to attack before American fighters arrived, less time to search for weak targets, less time to try multiple approaches. The mathematics of air combat had changed. And it had changed because bomber gunners were no longer waiting. They were shaping the battlefield before the enemy even reached firing range. The turning point, by late 1944, the effectiveness of German fighter attacks against bomber formations had dropped dramatically. Losses were still occurring. War in the air was never safe, but the numbers were German fighters were now losing aircraft at a faster rate. Attacks took longer. Pilots had to make multiple passes. Fuel consumption increased. And every extra minute in the air increased the chance of encountering American escort fighters. The Luftwaffe was slowly losing the ability to stop the bombing campaign, and the bombing campaign was destroying German industry, oil refineries, aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, rail networks. The pressure on Germany's war economy became overwhelming. Historians would later debate exactly how much the early fire technique contributed to that outcome. But one thing was certain: the skies over Germany had changed. And the change had started with a simple idea: fill the airspace, deny the corridor, make the enemy hesitate. By late 1944, the skies over Germany had changed in ways that few people fully understood. American bomber formations were still flying deep into enemy territory. German fighters were still rising to intercept them. The war in the air was far from over. But the balance had shifted. The Luftwaffe pilots noticed it first. Combat reports from German fighter units began describing something unusual. American bomber gunners were firing earlier than ever before, much earlier than any training manual would recommend. Tracers appeared at extreme range, sometimes as far as 1,500 yards away, long before the fighters reached their optimal firing position. At first, German intelligence officers assumed it was panic, untrained gunners wasting ammunition, desperate crews firing wildly into empty sky. But the statistics told a different story. Luftwaffe fighter losses were rising, not dramatically at first, but steadily. In early 1944, German fighters had been trading one aircraft for every 2 bombers destroyed. By mid-1944, the ratio had shifted. Now they were losing 1 fighter for every 4 bombers. Something had changed in the equation of aerial combat, and that change was psychological as much as physical. German pilots began describing the same experience again and again. Approaching a bomber formation, seeing tracers far ahead of the target, watching orange streaks fill the sky before they even started their dive, and suddenly feeling uncertain. Was the gunner lucky? Was the fire accurate? Would pressing the attack mean flying directly into a stream of bullets? Many pilots aborted their attack runs earlier than they once had. They circled, they searched for easier targets. 1944, easy targets were becoming rare. Almost every bomber had at least 1 gunner firing early now. Almost every formation created that same invisible barrier in the sky. The wall of fire had become a reality. The collapse of the Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They experimented with new tactics: high-altitude diving attacks from beyond defensive range, coordinated mass assaults with multiple fighter groups attacking at once, heavily armored interceptors designed to absorb defensive fire. But Germany was running out of something more important than tactics: fuel, experienced pilots, time. By late 1944, many Luftwaffe fighter units were flying with barely trained pilots, young men with only a few hours in combat aircraft. They were facing American bomber crews who had already survived 10, 15, sometimes 20 missions. Veteran gunners who knew exactly when to fire, exactly where to aim, and exactly how to make an attacking pilot hesitate. The German fighter slowly began to collapse. By September 1944, the effectiveness of Luftwaffe attacks against heavy bombers had dropped to less than half of what it had been the previous year. Fighters could still shoot down bombers, but it took longer. It required more aircraft. And it exposed them to American escort fighters for much longer periods. Every extra minute spent attacking bombers meant a greater chance of encountering American Mustangs or Thunderbolts. The air war over Germany was turning decisively in favor of the Allies. Archangelo's final missions, Michael Archangelo continued flying combat missions through early 1945. Mission after mission, long flights over Germany, endless hours in the cramped steel ball turret beneath his bomber, watching the sky, watching for fighters, watching for the moment when he needed to fire. He eventually completed his 25th mission. In March 1945, that number was important. 25 missions meant a bomber crew had completed its combat tour. Statistically, very few crews made it that far. Archangelo had survived. Ironically, the 2 confirmed fighter kills he received during the war happened at close range, traditional shots, both under 600 yards. The kind of shots the manuals had always taught, but those kills weren't the real story. The real story was the dozens of attacks he had disrupted, the enemy fighters he had forced to break away, the moments of hesitation that had kept his bomber and his crew alive. Again and again. Archangelo never received a medal for developing the technique. The Army Air Forces never officially credited him with inventing it. In wartime bureaucracies, innovations from enlisted men rarely appeared in official reports. But the other gunners knew, the sergeants knew, the mechanics and crew chiefs knew, and the idea kept spreading. After the war, when the war ended in 1945, Michael Archangelo returned home to Philadelphia. He went back to the machine shop where he had worked before the war. He married, raised 3 children, lived a quiet life. To most people who knew him, he was just another veteran, a former bomber gunner who had served in World War II. He rarely spoke about the war, rarely talked about the missions or the fighters diving toward his bomber at 500 miles per hour. He died in 1998 at the age of 77. His obituary mentioned his military service. But it didn't mention the idea he had helped spread across the skies of Europe, the idea that had quietly changed the mathematics of aerial combat. The technique lives on, but the concept Archangelo had discovered did not disappear. It survived. During the Korean War in the early 1950s, B-29 bomber gunners faced a new threat. Jet fighters, the Soviet-designed MiG-15. The MiG was faster than anything that had flown during World War II. It could reach speeds over 670 miles per hour. But its pilots were still human. They still saw tracers. They still reacted to incoming fire, and the B-29 gunners used the same principle Archangelo had discovered. Fire early, fill the airspace, force an attacker to hesitate. The technique appeared again during the Vietnam War. Helicopter door gunners used suppressive fire against enemy forces hidden in jungle tree lines. They fired before the enemy attacked, not always to hit, but to keep the enemy's head down, to control the battlefield. The principle was the same: control the airspace, deny the enemy the freedom to act. Modern doctrine in the 1980s, military analysts began studying these historical patterns more formally. Computer simulations, historical combat data, training exercises with modern fighter pilots. The results were clear. Early defensive fire, even inaccurate fire, reduced the effectiveness of enemy attacks by 30 to 40%. Modern air combat doctrine adopted the concept officially. They gave it a name: preemptive defensive engagement. Fighter pilots today learn that if an enemy aircraft approaches within threatening range, they should not wait for the perfect shot. They engage early. They launch missiles. They fire bursts. They force the enemy to react. The same principle is built into modern weapon systems. Naval ships use automated guns like the Phalanx close-in weapon system. When an incoming missile approaches, the system fires thousands of rounds per minute. The goal is not necessarily a direct hit. The goal is to fill the airspace with metal. Create a barrier, the missile must fly. Probability does the rest. Archangelo would have understood the idea instantly, because that was exactly what he had done in his ball turret: fill the airspace, deny the corridor, let the enemy make the mistake. A simple truth: historians still debate how much the early fire technique contributed to the Allied victory in Europe. Some believe it helped reduce bomber losses enough to keep the strategic bombing campaign going. Others argue it was just one factor among many, but there is little doubt about one thing: it changed the behavior of enemy pilots. It forced them to think twice. And sometimes in war, that single moment of hesitation can mean the difference between life and death. The man behind the idea, Michael Archangelo, never claimed to be a hero. When an aviation historian interviewed him in 1995, he shrugged when asked about the technique. "I just did what made sense," he said. "You see tracers coming at you. You think twice." He paused for a moment, then added quietly, "Doesn't matter if you're German or American. Human nature doesn't change." And he was right. Human nature doesn't change. The instinct to avoid danger, the instinct to hesitate when death appears in front of you. Those instincts are universal. And sometimes understanding those instincts can change the outcome of battles, of campaigns, even of wars. All because a 22-year-old machinist from Philadelphia decided to break the rules. 27,000 feet above Germany, in the freezing sky, October 1943.